Taking a look at a precipitation perspective and how timing actually matters for our rainy season. I'm ABC 10 Chief Meteorologist Monica Woods, and as we look at building a water year, timing really does matter. We're going to unpack layer by layer why it does indeed. Our fall rain starts in October into November, but 50% of our annual precipitation happens in December, January, and February. By the end of March into early April, we start to see that peak snowmelt. So it really does matter what our peak snowpack is looking like at the end of March, with the water at our highest demand during the driest and warmest part of the year. Our entire infrastructure throughout California has been built on this pattern developing throughout the course of not only our wet season, but our dry season. It's kind of feast or famine here in California, and we're going to be following it all through the rainy season. You want to make sure to download that ABC 10 Plus streaming app wherever you stream, with in-depth forecasts. Plus, we've got explainers and weather specials there. That's a lot of content. It's kind of fun to watch all the different layers of California's weather. All right, let's take a look at our start to the rainy season. And it's been a really good start for downtown Sacramento. Over 3.5 inches of rain fell in November, a large part of it in about a week span, actually. But you can see before that, it was very dry. The last time we had significant precipitation, we had to go all the way back into the beginning of May, and then it just absolutely shuts down. This is very typical, though, for California. As I mentioned, it's feast or famine. We have a wet season and a dry season. Our statewide precipitation since the beginning of the water year, October 1st, is looking pretty good, especially throughout Northern California. This is where we want to see the bulk of the precipitation because, again, the entire water infrastructure has been built on the idea of a lot of precipitation falls in Northern California, and then we send it down south where we see continuous drier conditions in Southern California. So seeing the big snowpack happen in the Northern Sierra is always a beneficial thing. And right now we're looking really good for our snow water equivalent. If we were to take this entire snowpack and melt it down, how much water would we be able to get from that? Well, at this point in the season, roughly about 100 to 200% of average for what we normally have this time of year. But again, I mentioned the end of March, beginning of April number for that snowpack. That's a real line of demarcation. Whatever we have at that point is going to start to fill our reservoirs. We have the snow melting. It fills these big bodies of water. And it really is a retaining pool of water for the drier part of the year. So right now, if we weren't to get any other snowpack, we'd only be at 15 to 25% of average for that April 1st date. Again, a very important date for our statewide average. And our average right now is at 134% average to date, percent of April 1st average, only 18. So we got a ways to go to get more snowpack in here. Let's take a look at that current number. Again, shaded in kind of this hilly shaded color. That's going to be the average for our snowpack. Here's where we are currently, and we're above average. I did want to point out where we were last year at this point. A really slow start to the season. I know ski resorts were just kind of struggling at the beginning of the year, but then things really picked up. We ended up with above average for the state, but it didn't happen until we got into March and April. So kind of got that miracle March going on. It was a very late start. However, that's actually good news for California. When we have a really big start and then everything dries out, warms up, we have an early melt. And that means water managers have to figure out a way to store all that water deep into our rainy season and hold it until the dry season. So you can see how things unfolded last year. For the first snow survey, this is when they go out with the very iconic snow tube and they put it into the ground and then they pull it out and they measure it. They see what kind of water content is in that snowpack and how much there is. And then they put out those numbers and the water allocations. Now, the first allocation that came out earlier this week was only 5%. And that's because it's, again, early in the season. It didn't account for the recent atmospheric rivers, but it did account for the record-setting summer heat. So a lot of evaporation happening over the summer season. Last year, this is how things unfolded. Like I said, it was a slow start, really picked up. So by that April 1st snow survey, we were at 113% at the Phillips Station, where they do one of the snow surveys. Our statewide average ended up at 110%. So things look pretty good, and all that continued to melt and move down the hill into our reservoirs. This is just a wrap up of how many atmospheric rivers we got. Again, atmospheric rivers, key component to our water year and how much we're going to be able to pull from rain and snow. We saw a large part of them going into the Pacific Northwest early on, and then things started to slide their way southward as the year progressed. And so this was actually a really favorable situation for us. Now, compared to what we saw the prior water year, we had huge atmospheric rivers, very destructive, coming in right at the end of December, early January. Huge flooding issues throughout the state right around the New Year's holiday. So unfortunately, that wasn't great news for everybody traveling. It did put some huge water into our reservoirs and was a drought buster. So you can see recent water years, it is feast or famine, both not only in the wet season, dry season, but also year to year. We have the highest variability in California than any other state in year to year precipitation. And you can see it laid out here. In 2021, we only had 7 3/4 inches of rain for the entire year for downtown Sacramento. And then compare that to some of our wetter years, drought buster years, 2016, 2017, where we had nearly 34 inches of rain. 2022, 23, that was a drought buster year, almost 26.5 inches of rain. And then it was still a little bit lower than average last year, but pretty good statewide for our snowpack. This year we have a little over 4 inches of rain so far. And all of that coming in from a huge atmospheric river. We saw a weaker one follow it, but one really strong atmospheric river. That is our primary feature for the global water supply. A strong atmospheric river carries 7 to 15 times the amount of water vapor as the mouth of the Mississippi River. So we track this across the globe, particularly for California. This time of year we track them because it brings us 25 to 50% of our water supply. So a couple of atmospheric rivers can do the trick. If we get 5 good atmospheric rivers, we usually meet a near average precipitation for the entire year. But they are also the main cause of flooding. So you get an exceptional one, just that fire hose of water coming in from the Pacific, and we get some catastrophic flooding. The absence of those atmospheric rivers result in drought. So let's take a look at our drought monitor. Just about a week ago, this is how things were shaping up throughout the state. And like I said, just alone when we had those atmospheric rivers come through, look at how the drought, the abnormally dry conditions completely erased in Northern California. We are seeing a little bit of growth in drought conditions in extreme southeastern California, just that tip there. But again, with the biggest reservoirs being in the northern part of the state, we really want to see more of that eroded in the northern part of the state. This is a look at the state water project and the initial allocation, 5%. This is based on current reservoir storage and the impacts from record summer heat. So they're being a little conservative in terms of how much the allocations will be. We were at about 10% last year, by the way, and by the end of the year, we went up to 40%. That just shows you the difference a couple of storms can make. So the recent storms not considered, and they are looking at dry, long-range outlook as well as a developing weak La Nina. We should get an update from NOAA next week on how La Nina conditions are shaping up. Right now, we're in a neutral position. Now, our major reservoir supply levels still pretty much status quo, 35 to about 70% full. We're running 85 to over 100% of average. And that's true as well as we make our way southward here into the Central Sierra reservoirs. So in terms of our supply levels, they are pretty healthy for this time of year. Our Shasta Reservoir did increase the water supply level with the recent atmospheric rivers coming through. So right now we're running a little bit ahead of schedule here. Again, here's kind of that hill shape. This shows the peak snow melt and the inflow for the reservoirs, and then the releases that happen during the dry part of the year. We're running just a little bit ahead of that. The 8 to 14-day climate outlook, it does continue to show likely warmer conditions, but perhaps a likely wetter weather pattern from the Climate Prediction Center by the middle and end of December. There is a lot of inconsistency, though, and very low confidence on this at this point. It's still about 10 days out as we head towards the end of next week into the beginning of the following weekend. The GFS model saying, yeah, we're going to start to see a more progressive pattern coming in from the Pacific. There's a lot going on in the Pacific. It just can't bust through our high pressure ridge, whereas the European model is saying, I think we're going to stay under that high pressure ridge with dry weather continuing. This is the point in our season, though, that it's really a turning point. Now, December matters, but January and February are really important months for us. We could kind of handle a dry December at this point because we had such a great November. Again, we had almost 4 inches of rain in the month of November alone, whereas we normally see about 1.75 inches. December, we could hold off on a little bit of a dry weather pattern, but once we get into January and February, if we don't pull in some of these numbers here, it is very unlikely we're going to be able to catch up by the time we get into March, April, and certainly May. It's just a real struggle, especially with a La Nina pattern developing. It does favor a wetter than average Pacific Northwest and extreme Northern California, but a drier than average Southern California. And that is pretty much how the Climate Prediction Center is leaning for our 90-day climate outlook. A likely wetter weather pattern with our precipitation through the Pacific Northwest and likely drier through extreme Southern California.